London, June 22nd, 1969. A locked bathroom door concealed the final hours of a woman destroyed by an industry that promised her eternity. Mickey Deans pounded on the heavy wood and called the name of his wife to absolutely no response. The official police report and the medical examiner later declared the primary cause of death as an incautious self-overdosage. That phrasing was a highly sanitized lie, constructed to protect a billionaire enterprise from facing justice. The executives who truly orchestrated her demise were thousands of miles away and 30 years in the past. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer signed her death warrant on a bustling soundstage long before her heart finally surrendered in London. We must look past the glamorous illusion to understand the exact architecture of this murder. When she was exactly 16 years old, this famous teenager kept a small cedar cigar box resting quietly on her vanity mirror. She did not smoke cigars. The heavy wooden lid concealed the dark truth of her daily survival and the absolute control of the studio system. Deep inside the corner of that cedar box sat a single bright yellow pill. That little yellow pill was the anchor of a horrific chemical chain, keeping a massive corporate empire alive. She belonged entirely to the men in tailored suits who calculated her human worth in box office receipts. She was the property of MGM. You remember the sweet farm girl carrying a woven basket in The Wizard of Oz? Audiences across America worshipped the radiant energy and the innocent smile beaming from every single printed magazine page on the newsstands. The world fell deeply in love with a cinematic facade constructed of bright lights and carefully painted studio scenery. The press fed the eager public a steady diet of wholesome charm and manufactured innocence to hide the bleeding wounds. Behind the heavy soundstage doors stood a terrified child trapped in a brutal cycle of amphetamines and chemical sedatives. The men at the top looked at a human being and saw only a machine that could print infinite money. They demanded 18 hours of relentless labor every single day under the blistering heat of industrial film lights. They stripped away her humanity and replaced it with a schedule of uppers to keep her dancing and downers to force her unconscious. The golden era of cinema was completely soaked in the quiet tears of those who could not escape the grip of the studio bosses. The executives built a golden cage and threw away the key. How exactly did a sweet girl from Minnesota end up locked inside this mechanical nightmare? The total destruction of her identity began long before the cameras started rolling in California. Frances Gumm was born into a family that viewed children as financial assets rather than human beings to be nurtured and protected. Her own mother dragged her into the grueling and unforgiving world of vaudeville theater. The young girl was pushed onto dusty wooden stages to perform for ruthless crowds, while her mother collected the meager wages in the back room. There was zero childhood warmth or maternal protection in the transient world of traveling performers. Her mother saw a living meal ticket and marched a young Frances directly into the crushing jaws of the entertainment industry. This relentless exploitation laid the psychological foundation for the horrific abuse that awaited her in Hollywood. She was taught from a very young age that love was strictly conditional upon her physical ability to entertain a paying audience. She learned that she had no intrinsic value as a person. The final nail in the coffin of her childhood arrived when her mother sold her entirely to the studio system for a steady paycheck. The executives of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer analyzed the young girl like ruthless farmers inspecting livestock at a crowded county fair. Louis B. Mayer sat behind his massive mahogany desk and scrutinized her curved spine and her natural physical figure with utter disgust. He decided instantly that her physical existence was entirely unacceptable for the silver screen. He looked directly at the vulnerable teenager and labeled her a little fat pig. That vile phrase shattered her fragile spirit and echoed in her mind for the rest of her tragic life. The most powerful man in Hollywood weaponized her deepest insecurities to ensure total psychological dominance over his new asset. He broke her down. The medical doctors employed by the studio immediately began their unnatural intervention upon her young body to mold her into an acceptable shape. They were not healers, but mechanics tasked with modifying a defective product on a corporate assembly line. They mandated a severe starvation regime that violently rejected normal human biology and basic medical ethics. The executives forced her to consume only plain chicken broth and black coffee to maintain a dangerously low body weight. They supervised her meals with a cold and clinical detachment to ensure she never consumed a single unauthorized calorie. The doctors demanded that she smoke 80 cigarettes every single day to artificially suppress her natural appetite. A growing teenager was chemically starved and physically punished for daring to possess a normal human form. She was surrounded by adults who profited immensely from her slow physical deterioration. They watched her wither away, and they blindly applauded the results on the movie screen. The isolation within the studio lot was absolute and completely deafening. She walked the glamorous halls, surrounded by hundreds of smiling professionals who all looked the other way while she suffered. The makeup artists painted over her deep exhaustion, and the costume designers tailored beautiful garments to hide her rapidly shrinking frame. Every single person on the payroll was complicit in the daily torture of a teenage girl. They chose their weekly paychecks over their basic human morality and their duty to protect a child. The isolation festered into a deep psychological wound that would never properly heal despite the adoration of millions of fans. She was drowning in plain sight while people bought tickets to watch her sing about rainbows. The bright lights blinded the public to the absolute horror unfolding directly behind the scenes. Every time she tried to express her hunger or her exhaustion, she was met with severe reprimands from the powerful men who tightly controlled her contract. They made it abundantly clear that she had absolutely no voice and no rights as an individual. She was a product. This systematic destruction of a vulnerable child is a stark reminder of the blood spilled to create cinematic magic. Anyone feeling a sense of deep outrage at the adults who sacrificed a little girl for fame and profit must stick around. Hit the subscribe button to follow this dark investigation deeper into the ruthless machinery of Hollywood. The true horror of how the studio executives chained her to those cameras and locked her inside a chemical prison is just beginning. The ink drying on the 1935 contract officially transformed a living teenager into a depreciating industrial asset. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer did not recruit a talented young girl with a beautiful voice. They bought a machine. The legal documents bound her entirely to a ruthless schedule that completely ignored human biology and basic legal protections for children. The executives on the top floor viewed her severe physical exhaustion as a highly inconvenient production delay rather than a massive medical emergency. They ordered their production managers to squeeze every single drop of profit from her small frame before the public grew tired of her face. The corporate machinery possessed zero empathy. The heavy wooden doors of the soundstage slammed shut every morning at exactly 5 o'clock to seal the teenager inside a manufactured reality. She stood under the blinding glare of massive industrial lights that pushed the temperature on the closed set to over 100 degrees. The heavy costumes weighed down her fragile frame while the thick makeup clogged her pores and trapped the sweat against her skin. She was forced to smile brightly and dance effortlessly while her muscles screamed in absolute agony from severe malnutrition and chronic sleep deprivation. The director demanded perfection on every single take and punished any sign of natural human fatigue with vicious verbal abuse. She was not allowed to be tired. The medical department on the studio lot operated exactly like a legalized drug cartel, serving the financial interests of the executives. Studio physicians funneled narcotics down the throats of child actors to sustain 72-hour continuous shooting blocks under the blistering studio lights. They pushed developing organs past the point of mechanical failure just to keep the cameras rolling through the dead of night. Alongside the brutal 72-hour shifts, alongside the daily 80 cigarettes, alongside the black coffee and the thin chicken broth, the executives meticulously built a chemical prison. They engineered a severe physical dependency that bound her strictly to the studio lot for her entire youth. She could not function without the doctors. The studio released countless photographs showing executives smiling warmly beside their young star to project a fabricated image of paternal care. The public saw a loving corporate family nurturing a prodigy. The grim reality behind the closed doors of the medical wing involved cold men injecting synthetic energy directly into the veins of an exhausted child. They monitored her vital signs strictly to calculate exactly how much more chemical stimulation her heart could physically tolerate before giving out entirely. A sudden death on set would halt production and cost millions of dollars in delayed theatrical releases. They kept her right on the razor edge of total cardiac failure. She spent her most formative years entirely disconnected from the normal rhythms of human existence. While other teenagers attended high school and experienced the simple joys of youth, she stood on painted marks, trying to remember her lines through a thick chemical haze. The relentless combination of extreme sleep deprivation and powerful narcotics severely warped her perception of reality. She began to view the massive sound stages as a terrifying prison where men in tailored suits dictated exactly when she could eat and when she could close her eyes. The bright studio lights burned her retinas, and the heavy woolen costumes suffocated her fragile body. She was completely trapped inside a nightmare. A human body can only operate on borrowed chemical energy for a limited amount of time before the biological debt finally comes due. When exactly did the catastrophic physical collapse begin? By her early 20s, the relentless cycle of uppers and downers entirely destroyed her central nervous system. She replaced natural sleep with heavy barbiturate comas, and natural energy with violent synthetic mania. The young woman who once skipped down a painted brick road now shook uncontrollably in the dark corners of her dressing room while waiting for her next prescribed dose. The terrifying hallucinations and the crippling paranoia crept into her mind during the rare moments she was left alone in the dark. Her brain could no longer distinguish between the terrifying reality of her exploitation and the drug-induced nightmares that haunted her broken sleep. The collapse was absolute and completely devastating. Every single nervous breakdown and every desperate hospital visit was meticulously erased by highly paid public relations agents. They stormed into emergency rooms and threatened medical staff to ensure no accurate records of her drug overdoses ever reached the eager press. The studio fixers wiped away her tears and physically dragged her out of hospital beds long before she was medically stable. They threw heavy powder makeup over her dark circles and pushed her directly back into the glaring lights of the soundstage. She remained the property of MGM. The sheer physical agony of her existence forced her to seek any possible escape from the brutal filming schedules. She begged the directors for a single day of rest, to allow her racing heart to finally slow down. The men behind the cameras simply laughed at her desperate pleas and signaled the production doctors to bring the medicine tray. She realized with absolute clarity that nobody in California cared if she lived or died as long as the film reels shipped to theaters exactly on time. The deep psychological scars from this profound betrayal bled into every single relationship she attempted to build for the rest of her tragic life. She trusted absolutely no one. She attempted to fight back against the powerful executives by refusing to leave her dressing room on several desperate occasions. The studio simply retaliated by suspending her pay and threatening to completely destroy her public reputation through orchestrated smear campaigns in the national tabloids. They held all the power, and they crushed her minor rebellions with overwhelming corporate force. She was a single exhausted woman fighting an entire billion-dollar industry built specifically to chew up and spit out young talent. The machine ground her bones into dust. Her physical voice began to falter as the years of chain smoking and severe chemical abuse ravaged her vocal cords. The studio bosses who once praised her natural talent now openly mocked her declining reliability and her frequent physical collapses. They blamed the victim for the exact addiction they had systematically forced upon her since she was a vulnerable teenager. They washed their hands of the moral responsibility and began looking for the next young girl to feed into their ruthless machinery. They discarded her the moment the maintenance costs exceeded her box office returns. But amidst the total destruction of her autonomy and her physical health, what was the true purpose of that small cedar cigar box sitting quietly on her childhood makeup table? Tell me in the comments below if the wealthy executives who built this brutal system deserve to be celebrated as cinematic pioneers or condemned as ruthless criminals. The wooden cigar box resting quietly on the vanity mirror of a 16-year-old girl held the absolute grim reality of the Hollywood machine. It was never a quirky habit or an innocent resting place for childhood trinkets. The box functioned strictly as a miniature drug dispensary, carefully established and maintained by the studio executives. Opening the heavy cedar lid revealed perfectly aligned rows of bright yellow amphetamine capsules, designed specifically to force a radiant smile onto her face at 5 in the morning. Beside the yellow pills sat the heavy barbiturates, strictly calculated to knock her completely unconscious by midnight when the cameras finally stopped rolling. The men in tailored suits did not just buy a talented performer to sing and dance for the paying audiences across America. Louis B. Mayer purchased a fragile human being and meticulously poisoned her day after day to maximize his massive financial return on investment. The studio bosses were fully aware of the lethal consequences. The miniature drug dispensary sat in plain sight, while the makeup artists powdered her exhausted face, and the wardrobe assistants tightly laced her restrictive garments. The adults in the room fully understood exactly what those little yellow pills were doing to her developing heart and her fragile nervous system. They watched her hands shake violently as she reached for the wooden box before every single musical number. They saw the sheer terror in her eyes when the chemical energy began to wear off, and the crushing weight of exhaustion threatened to collapse her small frame on the wooden floorboards. Nobody intervened to save the terrified teenager, because every single paycheck on the studio lot depended entirely on her ability to perform on cue. She was completely surrounded by smiling enablers who gladly sacrificed her physical health for their own financial stability. They fed her to the wolves. The brutal truth is that the final collapse of her physical body in London at the age of 47 was absolutely not a tragic accident or a personal failing. It was a slow and calculated murder methodically scheduled by powerful men 3 decades prior on a bustling soundstage in California. Every single prescription signed by a compliant studio doctor pushed her one step closer to that locked bathroom door and the fatal quietness that followed. The medical professionals who swore a sacred oath to do no harm functioned strictly as ruthless corporate mechanics who kept the star heavily medicated and perfectly compliant. The eager public believed they were watching a magical and heartwarming journey over the rainbow while they were actually witnessing a real-time execution broadcast in full color. The blood is forever stained on the celluloid reels. The executives fully realized that a human heart could only sustain the violent chemical whiplash of uppers and downers for a finite number of years before completely shutting down. They calculated the exact depreciation of her biological organs against the projected box office receipts of her upcoming theatrical releases. They knew she was slowly dying, and they simply accelerated the production schedule to capture every last profitable frame before she finally collapsed. The legal contracts bound her tightly to a system that treated her inevitable death as a minor administrative inconvenience rather than a profound human tragedy. The men at the very top of the corporate pyramid completely escaped justice, while the woman they destroyed took the full blame for her terrifying addiction. They walked away with the millions. What exactly remained of the little girl they systematically dismantled? The coroner in London strictly listed an accidental overdose to neatly close the medical file on a very messy and highly publicized tragedy. The sanitized official document deliberately ignored the brutal history of forced chemical dependency mandated by the most powerful film studio in the world. The chemical agents that ultimately stopped her exhausted heart traced directly back to the very first yellow pills placed in her small hand 30 years earlier. The true cause of death was not a sudden mistake made in the dark corners of a foreign bathroom. The true cause of death was the greedy and relentless Hollywood machine that demanded complete ownership of a human soul. A single yellow pill rolling across the cold bathroom tile in 1969 carried the heavy and unforgiving weight of a billion-dollar cinematic empire. That brightly colored capsule represented every single stolen childhood hour and every single tear wiped away by aggressive public relations fixers. The golden era of early Hollywood was entirely built over the broken bodies and the shattered minds of the vulnerable children it falsely claimed to immortalize on the silver screen. The stunning cinematic masterpieces that still captivate audiences today hide a horrific legacy of physical abuse and unchecked corporate power. The industry chewed up a sweet girl from Minnesota and violently spit out a broken woman who could no longer survive the deafening silence of her own mind. The executives who orchestrated this massive tragedy attended the lavish funerals of their fallen stars and shed fake tears for the flashing cameras of the press. They stood over the expensive caskets and loudly praised the incredible talents of the victims they had personally pushed to the absolute brink of insanity. The unbelievable hypocrisy of the studio system remains one of the darkest and most heavily guarded secrets in the entire history of modern entertainment. They built magnificent theaters and filled them with the joyous songs of a woman who was slowly dying right in front of the massive lenses. Was the fleeting magic of a classic cinematic masterpiece truly worth the total physical and psychological destruction of Francis Gum? The vintage cameras stopped rolling a very long time ago, but the restless ghosts of the studio system absolutely still haunt the dark and quiet corners of the industry. The glittering facade of unimaginable fame and endless wealth continues to hide the blood and the quiet desperation of those trapped entirely inside the corporate machine. You have seen the dark reality behind the greatest and most profitable lie ever told by the eager entertainment press. Subscribe to this channel to uncover the next buried truth of the Golden Age and expose the monsters hiding behind the glamorous curtains. We will never stop asking the hard questions.